The sun had long set over Splash Cove, draping the skeletal remains of the once vibrant water park in eerie twilight. The distant sound of water dripping echoed like a heartbeat, sharp and irregular, as Jamie Turner flicked the last hot dog onto a slightly stale bun. He glanced up at the empty tables surrounding the cracked wave pool, its stagnant water reflecting the pale moonlight. The water park, once teeming with families during the peak of summer, now stood abandoned. The onset of late autumn brought biting winds that crept under Jamie's uniform. Leaves, long drowned in rainwater, clogged the lazy river, and rust streaked the towering water slides. The smell of damp rubber and mildew hung heavy in the air. For Jamie, the park's desolation was both a blessing and a curse. At 17, he had spent countless shifts flipping hot dogs and cleaning greasy grills. With only a few days left before the park shuttered for good, he had hope for peace. No screaming children, no overbearing parents demanding refunds for lukewarm food, but the stillness was unsettling. It wasn't the quiet of rest, it was the quiet of something waiting. As he cleaned the counter, Jamie's mind wandered. The sudden decision to close Splash Cove last season had sent ripples through their small town. Some claimed poor management, others murmured about a tragic accident swept under the rug. No one spoke of it directly, but there were whispers of something else. Stories told by those who stayed late. The lifeguard who claimed he saw figures standing at the edge of the wave pool after hours. The janitor who swore he heard children laughing in the dead of night. Jamie brushed off the stories as local gossip. Yet tonight, as the wind rattled the loose bolts of the hot dog stand, he couldn't shake the unease. He looked at the clock. 10:37 p.m., another 23 minutes, and he could leave. A sudden noise made him freeze. A splash, faint and distant, cut through the stillness. His eyes darted to the wave pool. The surface rippled, though there was no wind strong enough to disturb it. Jamie squinted, his pulse quickening. "Hello?" he called out, the word hanging in the air before dissipating into silence. Only the dripping water answered. Trying to steady his nerves, he returned to wiping the grill. The rhythmic squeak of the cloth seemed deafening. He told himself it was nothing, an animal maybe, or debris falling into the pool. But the sound of splashing returned, louder this time, accompanied by something else. Laughter. High-pitched, fleeting, and unmistakably childlike. Jamie stopped mid-swipe. His throat tightened as he strained to hear. The laughter came again, faint but undeniable, as if carried on the wind. He turned toward the sound, scanning the darkened park. The laughter stopped. Silence fell over Splash Cove once more, but it was heavier now, suffocating. Jamie's hands trembled as he hurried to close the stand. He didn't want to linger, not tonight. Something was wrong. He felt it in his chest, a primal warning, like prey sensing the gaze of a predator. The shadows seemed longer, the dripping louder. Jamie fumbled with the lock, his eyes darting toward the wave pool one last time. In the faint moonlight, he thought he saw movement, a ripple too deliberate to be the wind. But when he blinked, the water was still. His shift wasn't over yet, but Jamie grabbed his jacket and started walking toward the exit, his footsteps echoing against the cracked pavement. The sound of dripping water followed him, relentless and steady, until it faded into the cold night air. Jamie's bike chain clinked faintly as he pedaled down the gravel path leading to Splash Cove for another shift. He had spent the entire morning trying to convince himself that the strange sounds from the night before were just echoes of an overactive imagination. By the time he reached the employee gate, the sun was dipping low again, casting long shadows over the lifeless park. He shoved his bike into the rack and grabbed the keys from his backpack, glancing uneasily at the park's entrance. The oversized plastic dolphin at the front, once the park's mascot, had lost its charm. Its smile was cracked, and its eyes seemed to follow him. He forced a breath and stepped inside. It started small. The flickering light above the hot dog stand buzzed angrily, blinking more erratically than usual. Jamie twisted the bulb tighter, but it didn't help. He ignored it and focused on setting up. Then came the sounds. Faint at first, just a rustle or a metallic creak. By the time Jamie noticed them, the sun had disappeared entirely, and the night's chill crept into his bones. As he scrubbed the counter, the sound of splashing water returned, louder and closer. He froze mid-swipe, his heartbeat quickening. "Not again," he muttered, trying to steady his nerves. But then he heard something that made his blood run cold. A child's voice, soft and lilting. "Can you help me?" Jamie's grip tightened on the cleaning cloth. He spun around, searching the park's dim expanse. Nothing. Just the dead rides and the shimmering wave pool. He shook his head, muttering, "It's just in your head. Nobody's here." He returned to his work, but the unease gnawed at him. His senses felt sharper, attuned to every small sound, the rustle of leaves, the groan of old machinery, and the unmistakable drip of water. He knew it wasn't his imagination when the laughter returned. This time it was layered, two, maybe three distinct voices, overlapping like a ghostly chorus. Jamie found himself looking over his shoulder every few seconds, his tasks abandoned. He thought about texting someone, his mom, his best friend, anyone. But what would he say? "Hey, the abandoned water park is freaking me out." No, he'd sound crazy. He decided to distract himself by exploring the employee break room near the back of the park. It was a small, windowless space filled with forgotten belongings, a stained couch, an ancient vending machine, and dusty lockers. As Jamie rummaged through the clutter for anything to occupy his mind, he found an old employee logbook shoved beneath a stack of manuals. The entries were mundane at first: shift notes, maintenance schedules, employee complaints about unruly guests. But as Jamie flipped through the pages, the tone shifted. One entry, dated just weeks before the park's closure, caught his attention. "Night shift, heard voices near the kiddie pool again. Thought it was just the wind, but the laughter, I swear I'm not imagining it." Jamie stared at the words, his pulse racing. He flipped it forward and found more entries, each growing more frantic. "Things keep moving around. I swear I locked the equipment shed, but the door was wide open this morning. Lights keep flickering, but it's not just a power issue. I feel like someone's watching me. Maybe it's just the late nights, but I don't want to do this shift alone anymore." The final entry was scrawled messily, almost illegible. "Saw them near the wave pool. They're not kids. They look like kids, but their eyes..." Jamie slammed the logbook shut, his hands shaking. The air in the break room felt suffocating, thick with something unseen. He stuffed the book into his bag and rushed outside, only to find the park even more unnerving in the dark. Back at the hot dog stand, Jamie tried to busy himself, but the distractions no longer worked. Shadows danced in the periphery of his vision, always vanishing when he turned to look. A chill passed over him, one that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The light above him sputtered and died, plunging the stand into darkness. "Great," he muttered, fumbling for his phone. The flashlight clicked on, cutting through the gloom, but the beam felt too narrow, like it could never illuminate enough of the encroaching shadows. Then something moved, a flicker of motion by the kiddie pool. Jamie whipped his flashlight toward it, but the light wavered as his hand trembled. "Hello?" he called out, his voice breaking. A faint splash echoed in response, followed by a low creaking sound. His flashlight caught the faint outline of a figure standing at the water's edge. It was small, childlike, but its head was tilted unnaturally to one side. As if curious, Jamie's heart thundered in his chest as he stepped back, nearly tripping over a loose paving stone. When he looked again, the figure was gone. Jamie couldn't take it anymore. He had to get out. He grabbed his bag and started toward the exit, but something stopped him, a faint light flickering behind the bumper boats. It wasn't part of the main park, just an old service road partially hidden by overgrown bushes. He had never noticed it before. Drawn by a mix of fear and morbid curiosity, Jamie followed the light. The road led him to a rusted gate, partially ajar. Beyond it lay a forgotten section of Splash Cove, a small pool surrounded by crumbling benches and an empty lifeguard tower. The area was eerily intact, as though frozen in time. Jamie's flashlight landed on a pile of items near the pool's edge. Backpacks, flip-flops, towels, all covered in a thin layer of grime. His stomach churned. The belongings looked hastily abandoned, untouched for years. Nearby, a small security station caught his eye. Inside, the screen of an ancient CCTV monitor flickered, displaying grainy footage. Jamie stepped closer, his breath catching as he recognized the date on the screen. It was the final day Splash Cove had been open. The footage played in a continuous loop, showing families enjoying the rides, the wave pool churning happily. But then, the image distorted. The water in the wave pool turned still, reflecting something dark. The families were gone. The camera panned, showing only the empty pool. And then there they were, The figures, small and still, standing at the water's edge, their faces obscured by static. Jamie stumbled back, the monitor's glow casting a pale light on his face. He knew without a doubt he had stumbled into something far worse than he could have imagined. The air inside the forgotten section of Splash Cove felt heavier, oppressive, as though it was trying to push Jamie out or trap him in. The faint hum of the old CCTV monitor filled the silence, broken only by the distant sound of dripping water. Jamie's stomach churned as he replayed the footage in his mind, those eerie figures standing by the wave pool. He stepped outside the small security station, the flashlight in his hand shaking slightly. The abandoned belongings near the hidden pool seemed wrong now, as if they were relics of something that should have stayed buried. Jamie's instincts screamed at him to leave, but something deeper, a mix of fear and curiosity, kept his feet planted. He had to know what had happened here. Jamie's flashlight beam swept over the hidden pool. The water was dark and still, reflecting the skeletal remains of the nearby trees. A rusted sign half submerged near the pool's edge read, "Splash Cove South, under construction," but the construction looked long abandoned. Then he saw it. Movement. A ripple disturbed the water's glassy surface. Jamie froze, his breath caught in his throat. He scanned the area, convinced it must be an animal, a raccoon or a stray dog, but there was nothing. Only the ripple growing wider, as if something just beneath the surface was shifting. The temperature plummeted. Jamie could see his breath now, small white puffs in the beam of his flashlight. He took a shaky step back, his shoes crunching on the gravel. That's when he heard it. Faint voices, muffled but unmistakable. They came from the pool, rising and falling like a distorted recording. Jamie's heart pounded. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The voices stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, but it lasted only a moment before the flashlight in his hand began to flicker. He cursed under his breath, shaking it violently, but the beam dimmed further until it blinked out entirely. Panic surged through him as he fumbled for his phone. He clicked on its flashlight, but the weak glow barely pierced the thick darkness. The voices returned, clearer now. A child's voice, trembling and soft, whispered, "We didn't mean to." Jamie's legs felt like lead. His mind screamed at him to run, but he stood rooted to the spot. Another voice joined the first, louder and more insistent. "Help us!" And then he saw them. Figures began to emerge from the shadows, their shapes barely visible in the dim light. They were small, childlike, but their movements were wrong, jerky and unnatural, as though marionettes guided by an unseen hand. Their faces were obscured, either by darkness or a trick of his panicked mind, but their presence was undeniable. Jamie staggered back, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he turned and bolted for the gate. He could hear them behind him, the sound of small, wet footsteps splashing against the pavement. His lungs burned as he ran, his only thought to get away. Jamie burst into the main section of the park, his chest heaving. The once familiar attractions now loomed like sinister monoliths. The wave pool, visible from the path, seemed to shimmer unnaturally in the moonlight. He swore he could see shadows flitting across its surface. The park wasn't the same. The atmosphere had changed, warped into something hostile. The faint metallic creak of the water slides echoed overhead as if the structures were groaning to life. The lazy river gurgled ominously, though it hadn't flowed in years. And the laughter was back, faint, distorted, and growing closer. Jamie stumbled toward the hot dog stand, desperate to gather his things and leave. But as he reached the counter, the air turned ice cold, and the stand's light flickered back to life, casting harsh shadows across the cracked pavement. The shadows moved unnaturally, stretching and twisting like living things. A sudden noise made Jamie whip around, a deep groan followed by a metallic clang. The Ferris wheel, long dormant, had begun to turn. Its rusted frame screeched in protest as the empty cars swayed in the night air. Jamie's breath caught as he saw a figure standing at the base of the wheel, small, unmoving, and staring directly at him. "No," Jamie whispered, shaking his head. His vision blurred with tears as he backed away. The figure didn't move, but the others did. From the shadows of the wave pool, the kiddie pool, and the towering slides, more shapes emerged, closing in. They didn't run or stumble. They simply appeared closer every time Jamie blinked. Jamie tripped over a loose paving stone, sprawling onto the cold concrete. The bag with the employee logbook spilled open, the book sliding out. His hands scrambled for it, desperate for some semblance of control. As he clutched it, a loose page fluttered free, landing in the beam of his flashlight. He recognized the scrawled handwriting from the break room. The words sent a chill down his spine. If you're reading this, it's too late. Don't trust what you see. Don't listen to them. They don't want help. They want you. The voices grew louder, surrounding him now. "Help us!" they chanted, their words overlapping until they became a deafening roar. Jamie squeezed his eyes shut, clutching the logbook like a lifeline. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of what he'd read and seen. The park hadn't closed because of an accident. It was something worse, something unspeakable. When he opened his eyes again, they were there. A dozen figures, their faces still obscured, standing motionless just feet away. One of them tilted its head slowly, unnaturally, as if studying him. Jamie did the only thing he could. He ran. Jamie's breaths came in ragged gasps as he sprinted through the desolate pathways of Splash Cove. The sound of his sneakers slapping against the cracked concrete mingled with the eerie cacophony surrounding him. Footsteps that didn't belong to him, the faint rustle of unseen movements, and that haunting, distorted laughter. He didn't dare look back. He didn't need to. He could feel them closing in. The exit was his only thought, a beacon in the chaos. The gate he'd entered through earlier seemed impossibly far now. Every corner he turned brought new horrors. The wave pool rippled violently, though there was no wind. A dry water slide groaned as if under the weight of invisible riders. The empty bumper boats spun in lazy, unnatural circles, their faint motors whining like dying animals. Jamie's legs burned, but he kept running. The figures appeared sporadically in the periphery of his vision, flickering in and out of the shadows like broken projections. Each time he blinked, they seemed closer, more distinct. Their faces were still obscured, but he could feel their eyes on him, piercing, cold, and full of malice. As he rounded the corner near the Ferris wheel, Jamie stumbled to a halt. The wheel was still turning, its rusted arms creaking ominously. One of the gondolas swung open and a figure stepped out. Small, childlike, but wrong. Its head tilted sharply, too far to one side as it raised a hand and pointed at him. Jamie screamed, the sound ripping from his throat unbidden. He turned and bolted in the opposite direction, tears streaming down his face. His mind raced, grasping for logic, for reason, but there was none. This wasn't just a haunting. This was a trap. The park seemed to twist around him, its layout unfamiliar despite the years he'd spent working there. Jamie found himself in areas he didn't recognize. Narrow alleys between food stands, overgrown pathways leading to nowhere. He reached a service tunnel that he swore hadn't been there before, its entrance gaping like a mouth in the darkness. With no other option, he plunged inside. The air was damp and reeked of mildew. The tunnel's flickering fluorescent lights buzzed weakly, casting long, jittery shadows. As Jamie moved deeper, he felt the temperature drop further. His breath puffed out in uneven clouds, and the sound of dripping water grew louder. The tunnel ended abruptly at a locked maintenance door. Jamie cursed, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. He spun around, his flashlight beam dancing wildly. The figures were there at the far end of the tunnel, standing silently, their heads tilted in unison, like curious predators. Jamie pounded on the door, desperation overtaking him. "Let me out," he screamed, his voice echoing off the narrow walls. As if in response, the lights above him flickered violently before plunging the tunnel into complete darkness. The sound of footsteps grew louder, accompanied by whispers, garbled, overlapping, incomprehensible. Jamie's phone flashlight clicked on just in time to illuminate a single figure inches from his face. Its head was tilted, its face shrouded in darkness, but its hand reached for him. Jamie yelped, stumbling back, and suddenly the door behind him gave way. He fell through, slamming it shut behind him and twisting the lock with trembling hands. Jamie found himself in a control room filled with outdated equipment, dusty monitors, rusted switches, and a desk cluttered with forgotten papers. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the room itself was alive. The monitors buzzed to life one by one, displaying grainy footage of the park. On the screens, Jamie saw the figures, dozens of them standing motionless in various locations, The wave pool, the slides, the bumper boats. But one screen caught his attention. It showed the main exit gate, just a short distance from where he was now. The gate was wide open, the empty street beyond bathed in the faint glow of streetlights. Jamie didn't think twice. He bolted from the control room, sprinting toward the exit. The park seemed to shift around him again, the paths twisting and narrowing, but the gate grew closer with every step. The figures didn't chase him now. They simply watched, their presence heavy and oppressive. As Jamie reached the gate, his chest heaving with relief, he noticed something on the ground near the turnstile. A folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle with age, sat in the dirt. Against his better judgment, he picked it up. The note was written in the same frantic handwriting as the employee logbook. If you've made it this far, you're not like the others. They want you to leave so they can follow. Don't look back. Jamie's breath hitched as the words sank in. The oppressive silence behind him was deafening now. He could feel the weight of countless eyes boring into his back. His instincts screamed at him to run, but the note's final line rooted him in place. Once you leave, you'll never be free of them. Jamie didn't look back. He stepped through the gate and onto the empty street, the chill of the night air biting at his skin. His legs moved mechanically as he mounted his bike and pedaled away, refusing to glance over his shoulder. The park loomed behind him, dark and silent, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. When he finally reached his house, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon. Jamie dropped his bike on the lawn and stumbled inside, locking the door behind him. He leaned against the doorframe, his body trembling. It was over. He was safe, or so he thought. As Jamie turned to head upstairs, his eyes caught something in the living room window. A shadowy figure stood in the yard, motionless, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. The sunrise bathed the streets in a soft orange glow, but Jamie's house remained cold and silent. Despite the warmth creeping into the world outside, Jamie's chest felt tight, his every breath shallow. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the window across the room. The figure had been there in the yard, staring up at him with that same unnatural tilt of the head. He had slammed the curtains shut, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching. Every creak of the old house set Jamie's nerves on edge. He hadn't slept. How could he? The events at Splash Cove played on a loop in his mind, the whispers, the laughter, the figures that seemed to multiply the harder he tried to escape them. His body ached from the relentless sprint to get away, but his mind refused to let him rest. Jamie grabbed his phone, scrolling through his contacts. Who could he tell? His mom, working the night shift, wouldn't be back until evening. His best friend Dylan would laugh it off or think he was losing it. Still, he typed a message. Dude, something happened at work last night. Something bad. I need to talk. The message sat unsent, the blinking cursor mocking him. What could he even say that wouldn't make him sound insane? He deleted the message and tossed the phone onto the bed. For the first time, Jamie felt utterly alone. The day dragged on, each hour heavier than the last. Jamie paced the house, jumping at every shadow, every distant sound. He refused to open the curtains, certain that the figures from the park would be there, waiting. But the longer he stayed inside, the more the house began to feel off. The familiar creaks of the old floorboards now sounded deliberate, like footsteps moving in another room. Objects shifted subtly out of place. A chair pushed slightly away from the table. A picture frame tilted on the mantel. Jamie tried to convince himself it was paranoia, exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. But when the laughter returned, faint and distant, Jamie knew he wasn't imagining things. He froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. It came from upstairs, a soft giggle that sent a chill racing down his spine. Jamie grabbed the closest object, a flashlight left on the kitchen counter, and crept toward the stairs. His heart hammered against his ribs with every step. The hallway at the top of the stairs was dark, the light bulb overhead flickering weakly. Jamie moved toward his bedroom, the laughter growing louder. It was muffled now, like it was coming from behind a closed door. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob. He twisted it slowly, the creak of the hinges sounding impossibly loud in the stillness. The room was empty, just as he'd left it. The curtains were still drawn, the bed unmade. But the laughter was louder now, as though it were coming from everywhere at once. Then he saw it. His reflection in the mirror above his dresser wasn't right. The face staring back at him was his, But something was off. The eyes were darker, sunken, as if the Jamie in the mirror had been awake for days. And he was smiling, a slow, chilling smile that Jamie knew he wasn't making. The flashlight clattered to the floor as Jamie stumbled back, slamming the door shut. His breath came in panicked gasps as he leaned against the wall, trying to convince himself that what he'd seen wasn't real. Jamie's mind raced back to the note he'd found near the park's exit. "Once you leave, you'll never be free of them." The figures hadn't stayed behind, they had followed him, and now they were inside his home. The whispers began, low and unintelligible, growing louder with each passing second. Jamie clapped his hands over his ears, sliding down the wall as he tried to block them out. The air around him felt heavy, suffocating, and the temperature plummeted. He squeezed his eyes shut, hoping it would all stop. But when the whispers suddenly ceased, the silence was worse. Jamie opened his eyes to find himself staring at the bottom of the stairs. The house was dark now, the sunlight gone, though he couldn't recall the sky growing dim. And then, from the shadows at the end of the hallway, a figure emerged. Its small frame was unmistakable, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. It stood perfectly still, watching him, its face obscured by the darkness. Jamie couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The figure raised its hand and pointed toward the window behind him. Slowly, Jamie turned. The curtains fluttered faintly, though there was no breeze. Beyond the glass, more figures stood in the yard, their heads all tilted in that same unnerving way. They didn't move. They didn't need to. Jamie could feel their malice, their hunger, pressing against the walls of the house. The note hadn't been a warning to avoid the figures. It had been a cruel truth. They were bound to him now, no matter where he went. He hadn't escaped Splash Cove. He had only invited its horrors into his life. The park had chosen him, just as it had chosen others before him, and there was no way out. As Jamie backed into the corner of the hallway, his reflection in the nearby glass cabinet smiled at him again. Wider this time, its eyes gleaming with dark amusement. The laughter echoed once more, filling every inch of the house, as the figures outside pressed closer to the windows. Jamie closed his eyes, his mind teetering on the edge of madness. He couldn't fight them. He couldn't escape them. The laughter echoed louder, resonating through Jamie's house like a sinister symphony. The figures pressed against the windows now, their dark silhouettes blotting out what little light the night offered. Jamie crouched in the corner of the hallway, clutching his knees to his chest, his mind racing for answers. What do they want? Why me? The cold seeped deeper into the house, turning the air brittle. Each breath Jamie took felt labored, as if the house itself was closing in. He couldn't hide forever. He had to act. Jamie's thoughts circled back to the employee logbook he had stuffed into his bag during his escape from the park. It was still in his backpack, lying abandoned at the foot of the stairs. There had to be something in those frantic entries, something that explained how to stop this. The whispers followed him as he crawled to his bag. The flashlight flickered faintly in his trembling hand, casting distorted shadows on the walls. He rifled through the bag, pulling out the logbook with unsteady fingers. The final entries replayed in his mind. They don't want help, they want you. Jamie flipped through the pages, scanning the increasingly erratic handwriting. The last entry caught his eye again, scrawled so messily it was nearly unreadable. Saw them near the wave pool. They're not kids. They look like kids, but their eyes. The sentence trailed off into a jagged streak of ink. Beneath it, a single line was underlined repeatedly. They come for the chosen, don't let them in. Jamie's heart sank. It was too late. He had let them in. The walls groaned as if under tremendous weight, the sound reverberating through the house. Jamie clutched the logbook, his knuckles white. The figures outside the windows were gone now, replaced by a suffocating darkness. But the oppressive presence in the house remained, thick and unrelenting. The whispers converged, growing louder and more distinct. They came from every direction now, circling him like vultures. Jamie screamed, the sound raw and broken, but it was swallowed by the voices. The laughter returned, sharper and closer than ever. Jamie's flashlight flickered one last time before extinguishing completely, plunging him into darkness. And then, he felt it, a cold, wet hand brushing against his shoulder. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Yet the sensation lingered, chilling him to the bone. The voices shifted, one rising above the others, A childlike voice, clear and impossibly close. "We found you." The room plunged into chaos. Shadows darted across the walls, the temperature plummeted, and the air filled with the metallic tang of ozone. Jamie stumbled back, his head pounding, as the figures materialized around him. Their faces were clearer now, sunken, hollow, their eyes black voids that seemed to pull at his very soul. Jamie's back hit the wall, his body shaking uncontrollably. He clutched the logbook like a lifeline, but the words within offered no salvation. The figures moved closer, their movements slow and deliberate. The one in the lead tilted its head, its mouth twisting into a grotesque approximation of a smile. "You're one of us now," it whispered, its voice distorted and layered with countless others. Jamie's vision blurred, his mind fracturing under the weight of the figure's presence. He screamed again, but his voice was drowned out by the cacophony. The walls around him seemed to dissolve into darkness, the house melting away until all that remained was the oppressive void and the figures closing in. As the figures surrounded him, Jamie felt his body grow cold, his limbs heavy. He tried to fight, to resist, but his strength ebbed away like water slipping through his fingers. In his final moments of lucidity, the truth became clear. Splash Cove hadn't chosen him at random. It had been waiting, drawing him in like it had drawn in others before him. The figures weren't just haunting the park, they were the park. They were its victims, its prisoners, and now its newest recruit. The last thing Jamie saw before the darkness consumed him completely was his reflection in the glass of the logbook's cover. His face stared back at him, pale and hollow, his eyes black voids. The morning sun rose over Splash Cove, casting long shadows across the abandoned water park. The air was still, the silence unbroken, save for the faint rustle of wind through the overgrown paths. At the edge of the wave pool, a single figure stood, small and still. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side as it watched the rippling water. In the pool's reflection, dozens of figures appeared, faint and fleeting, as though caught between worlds. And at the center of them, a new shadow lingered. Jamie Turner had found his place among them.